This is part 2 in the RCA Victor CP-1 repair series. In the previous video I got as far as taking the entire machine apart into its major assemblies. In this video I'll be looking at the transport mechanism. Now, I hadn't intended to take it apart to this degree. I was just going to give it a clean and lubricate it and make sure that all the wheels and shafts were running freely. But unfortunately the motor mounts have completely disintegrated, and the motor was just sitting loose in the plate, so it wasn't going to work like that. It does need to be aligned in a fairly stiff manner because it's on a long shaft, and if this shaft moves around too much, it's not going to properly engage with the various gears. There's a lot of wear in this, so I may have to make a new one of these drive pulleys. It's not complicated, it's be quite an easy machining job, but I'll see how it works. But the issue with this is the relative sizes of these sections determine the speed that the various parts of the machine run at, and if they're too badly worn, then the machine will run at the wrong speed, and the tape will obviously run at the wrong speed as well, and it will sound wrong. This motor is quite stiff, just needs a bit of lubrication, I think, and cleaning up. And this is only really a repair series, it's not a restoration, so I'll be minimising the amount of work that I'm doing on it. But I do need to obviously replace these motor mounts because if I left them how they were, it just wasn't going to work. Also, some of these linkages do need tightening up, they are a bit too loose. Now, obviously taking something apart like this is always a bit of a risk. Getting it back together can be a bit tricky, especially on a mechanism like this where half of the pulleys and spindles are on one half and the other half are attached to the other part. But the main thing with something like this, if you ever do it and you get lost as to how it all goes together, is look at the springs. Remember that the springs are there for a reason and they will be in tension. Also, anything with a linkage that's got a coupling halfway down it, again, that's there for a reason. So what you're trying to find is a way to make the mechanism do what it kind of wants to do. Bear in mind that the springs should be actively trying to make the mechanism work, and that way you can normally figure out where the various linkages go. Linkages like this, you've got a spring, you've got a connection here, so you can figure out, partly based on the wear pattern as well, exactly where this thing's supposed to sit within the mechanism. Now, one of the things that I thought was a bit strange here, you probably can't see it, but there's something welded or stuck to the outside of this drive drum. It almost looks like part of a belt, but there were no belts in this. I'm not quite sure what it's doing there. I need to take it off because this is a drive surface. So basically all the gears and pulleys and the rubber drive wheels bear on these surfaces, and so it's a friction drive. That one doesn't actually turn, it's completely frozen, so I need to free that up. But anything like this is obviously going to stop the machine from running freely, so it needs to be cleaned off. So I will take these off and lubricate the shafts, then I'll flip the thing over and pull these out completely so I can get to the various spindles, and I'll clean those up and then reassemble and lubricate it. But I need to find some replacements or something I can use for the motor mounts. As I say, it does need to be fairly stiffly mounted, otherwise it's just not going to work properly. The rest of it seems to be in fairly good order. There are some kind of depressions in some of the rubber rollers. It's obviously been sitting inactive for a long time with the spring tension pulling the rollers into some of the spindles, and it does tend to leave permanent impressions or semi-permanent. What I normally do is gently heat them up with a hot air gun. I'm not trying to get them really hot and melt them. I'm just trying to kind of relax the rubber a little bit, and that generally will kind of go a long way to restoring their original shape. But otherwise it's not too bad. It'll just take an hour or so to get this sorted out, and then I can get it reassembled and flip it over, start seeing if it runs freely. If not, I'll find out what's binding up and work on that. But once this is done, I can move on to the chassis and start looking at the electronics. I wasn't able to find any suitable bushes that exactly matched the originals. They were a bit of an odd shape. So what I'm using is some more modern rubber grommets, which have a bit more give in them than the originals, but they're not quite as thick, so it should give us the same overall cushioning effect. But because they were different thickness, I had to machine up a set of spacers. So these spacers go through the grommets. They replace the original spacers, which were just plain bushes, and obviously the wide bit at the end makes up for the fact that the grommets aren't as thick. So they'll go through here. Then there's a washer on the other side that will move the centre of the plate into the right location. So that's that problem resolved. I still need to tighten this, it's way too loose. The issue I have at the moment is I've removed the main capstan shaft and flywheel. This is it. And while the shaft itself is in very good condition, there's hardly any wear, and there's hardly any wear on the phosphor bronze bush. You can see the capstan at the end is very badly pitted. Now there's nothing I can do about the pitting, but I need to clean this up, because this being so rough, if the tape does stall or slip, this will just chew straight through the tape. It needs to be fairly smooth, otherwise it will severely damage the tape. It is quite worn, there's a little step on it, but it's not bad enough to warrant making a new one, and it will still be slightly pitted when I've cleaned it, but the pitting will be smoothed off when I polish it, so it won't damage the tape, and the overall size should be about correct. So I'll get that done. I think that's it as far as the mechanism is concerned. I'll just need to reassemble it, make sure it all spins freely, lubricate the various parts, figure out how it all goes back together, and then I can flip it over and start looking at the top side, which doesn't seem to need as much work. So that is the capstan cleaned up. It's come up reasonably well. I took about 3/1000 of a millimetre off it, polished it up, and now all the pitting's fairly minimal. You can still see it, but I don't want to go too far, otherwise it will affect the speed of the tape. But it is now smooth enough to operate without damaging the tape, and the tape won't stick to it either. So that can now go back in. I can refit the motor. Just got a bit of cleaning up to do on the underside of the chassis, and then I get all this reassembled, and then I can turn the chassis over and start work on the top. So I have the transport mechanism reassembled. There are a couple of issues I need to look at, although only one I'm likely to do anything about. The first one is that when I power this up, it now spins freely. I freed up the motor. There were various pulleys that were seized up, so I freed those up. It didn't take very long. Reassembled it. Took me a while to get it to operate properly. It wouldn't fast forward, and it turned out it was assembled wrong. This lever was on upside down, so I'm not quite sure what's happened there. It doesn't appear to have been changed recently, so I've got no idea how that could have been on the wrong way up. I didn't take it off because I didn't need to take this off to remove the top plate, so when I reassembled it, it just wouldn't engage the way it should, and I realised that it was on the wrong way up. So I've corrected that. It now works fine as far as driving the spools. The problem I have is it makes a loud bumping noise, a continuous knocking noise, and that turned out to be caused by this. This is the primary idler wheel, so this sits between the motor shaft and the main capstan flywheel, and unlike all the other wheels that engage or disengage when you press one of the keys, this wheel's engaged all the time. It's pressed against the motor spindle and the wheel that it drives, and it's pulled against that all the time with a spring. There's not a lot of tension, but I think what's happened is over the decades when it's been sitting there idle, what's happened, as you can see here, is that there's a depression in the outside of the wheel where it's been pressed against the motor shaft, and every time that now goes past the motor shaft it makes a bumping sound. I have tried to heat this and it has improved it a bit, but it's still way too loud, so I need to do something about sorting this out to quieten it down. If this was my machine, there is two changes I would make. I'm not going to do them because it's not my machine, I'm just repairing it for somebody else. The first one is, this is a 60 Hz motor. It's 110 volts, which is not a problem, but being 60 Hz means that the machine on our 50 Hz supply will run too slowly. So as I said, if this was mine, what I would do is machine a new pulley. So there's a pulley that sits on the motor shaft, and it's got 3 sections of different diameters that drive various pulleys for various functions. The very top part of it you can't really see on camera is the part that engages with this, and that determines the playback speed. So this is a 45mm idle wheel, and what I would do is change the diameter of the aluminium pulley that's on the motor shaft and fit a smaller pulley. This would resolve both problems. It would remove or replace this faulty indented pulley, but it would also increase the speed of the motor. So it's very easy to calculate the size you'd need. Just machine up a quick either a complete new pulley or a bushing to go on the existing one, and that would correct the speed and quieten it down. But all I'm going to do is just try and sort the problem out with this wheel. I'm not going to make up a new pulley for it. As I said, it's not my machine, so I don't really want to modify it. Okay, so I'll go and do that, refit the pulley and see if it resolves the problem. So I've redressed this wheel. I've got rid of the bump, the dimple that was in there. So now it spins freely. It's also round. If you do this, what you're looking for is a nice flat surface, so it's flat across the face, and kind of dull grey matte finish, but it needs to be round, which of course it is. This is also the lever that had a lot of play in it. It was flopping about all over the place, so I've tightened up the pivot so it now properly supports this wheel and it doesn't rock about everywhere, but obviously it's still free to pivot. So I'll get this refitted. Assuming it works and the knocking noise has stopped, then I can move on to the electronics. Okay, so I've refitted the idler pulley. What I'll do now is power it up, see if it spins freely, and see if the loud knocking noise has stopped. Yep, that sounds good. The loud knocking has stopped. It's just the hum from the motor. A little bit of noise from some of the pulleys, but other than that it's now running quite smoothly. I'll flip it over and we'll try the controls to make sure that works, and then that will be it for the transport mechanism. Okay, so I have it the right way up. As you can see, I've removed the plastic parts for cleaning and some repairs. I need to replace the rubbers underneath this frame, so it will hum a bit because the frame is pressing hard down onto the carcass, and it should be spaced up by some rubber bushes, but they've completely collapsed in the same way that the ones on the motor did. I've cleaned up the mechanism. You can see everything's now nice and clean. I need to replace some pads that have dropped off these 3 arms. These push the tape against the heads, but what I want to do here is just test that the transport mechanism works. I'll switch it on so you can hear the motor spinning. It will quieten down a bit once it's been given a chance to run for a while. We can see the capstan spinning. It spins all the time, it's engaged all the time, but I have bypassed the switch that engages the motor, so normally the motor doesn't run all the time. It would only run when one of the keys is depressed, but I've bypassed that just to make the testing a bit easier. So the first button is the play button. So as you can see, this is spinning at the right speed. These arms, by the way, are the end of tape detectors. They're a bit stiff at the moment, so I need to lubricate these and get them freed up. But the idea is when you get to the end of the tape, this is looped around the tape, so it forms a kind of a loop that gets pulled tight when the tape comes to an end, and then it pulls the arm across and it disengages the motor. You can see it's now stopped spinning. We've got the rewind. You can see that's spinning fast, and again the end of tape detector has gone out. And the same with the fast forward, so this one's spinning faster. Again, same thing with the end of reel detection. You've got one for one direction and one for the other direction. So as I say, I need to free these up. They're freeing up as I use them. This has obviously not been used for a very long time. Okay, and the button on the end that I need to repair is the stop button. So stops any of the other three. But as you can see, it's starting to work quite nice and freely. It is getting much easier to press the buttons as they free up. I have lubricated it, but even so it takes a while for the lubrication to get to the right parts. But once that's done, it should be able to handle a tape at the right speed. Well, I say the right speed, remember that I haven't modified the motor pulley, so this particular machine will run too slowly, but now we're at the point where I can try putting a tape in. Everything's cleaned up, so nothing should grab the tape. It should move smoothly. I just need to make sure at the moment I don't drive it to the end of the tape because the end of tape detectors are a little bit too tight. So it goes in like that. I can now press play and we can see it is indeed moving the tape through nice and smoothly. It's not grabbing. You've got to be careful it doesn't grab this and pull it round if it's not smooth or not clean. I can fast forward and I can rewind. As I say, if the tape goes tight it will pull this across and stop. Okay, so that's it for the transport mechanism at the moment. I've got a few small jobs left to do, but now I'll go on to the electronics, and if I can get the electronics sorted out, then the next step will be to just temporarily hook it all together and see if it actually will play the tapes.